Welcome, everyone, to this terrific fraud panel. I'm Don Gibson, Dean of the Business School, and you must be a bunch of accounting students. Is that right? Anybody not an accounting student? You can raise your hand. Come on. Good for you. Thank you. Excellent. All right, welcome. We have a terrific opportunity tonight. I want to thank a few people for putting this together, and I want to note, those of you who are in accounting are part of a terrific accounting program at Fairfield University in the Dolan School of Business. You may know that we are ranked #1 in Connecticut by one of the ranking, I can't remember which ranking agency, but anyway, and in the top 25 nationally. So this is a terrific faculty that you have, and a terrific, we've attracted terrific students who often go, over 95% of them, I think, end up in Big Four accounting firms. So I really want to thank the faculty and success of that department. We talk a lot as a Jesuit school about ethics, and that ethics should permeate all of your classes, particularly your finance and accounting classes. And a key element of ethics is step one is recognizing when an ethical violation has occurred, or tonight we're going to speak of it as fraud. And then the second step is to actually do something about it, to take action. And I think tonight you're going to hear a story about someone who took direct action, really saw something, and wanted to make it right. If you are standing, there are fabulous seats down here. There's a couple seats right there, so there's no reason anybody needs to stand. All right, I have to give one other advertisement. And that is that tomorrow night is our terrific startup competition. It's the Shark Tank of Fairfield. It's in the Quick Center. It's at 6:30. I highly recommend that you go there and see those entrepreneurs, students present their business plans. But for now, I would like to introduce the chair of the accounting department, Joan Lee, who has done a terrific job putting this together. I'd also like to thank PwC. How many students think you're going to go to PwC? Any out there? Oh, yeah. Are you seeing these? About 30 to 40 students go to PwC every year. We want to thank you for sponsoring this event, and I give you Joan Lee. Thank you.
I just want to also add my thank you to all of you for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Vic Hartman, who's going to be our moderator for the panel. Vic is an adjunct professor here at Fairfield, where he teaches our master's level forensic accounting course. He's the founder of the Hartman firm in Atlanta, Georgia, specializing in forensic accounting and internal investigations. Vic's also an attorney and a CPA licensed in Georgia. Prior to entering private practice, Vic spent 25 years as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If you didn't catch that, that's the FBI. He practiced as a street agent, a supervisory special agent, and chief division counsel. Vic oversaw the Houston Division's white-collar crime program, which included bank fraud, securities fraud, healthcare fraud, and public corruption. Vic also played leadership roles in the early phases of both the Enron and WorldCom frauds. These and other corporate failures necessitated the creation of the FBI's corporate fraud response team, of which Vic served as a member. So thank you, Vic.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Dr. Lee. And I'm excited to be here because I'm teaching here as well, but more importantly because I just have really two exciting colleagues that are going to participate in this panel. So to my immediate right is Dr. Sri Ramamurthy, and it's my privilege to introduce this first panelist. Dr. Ramamurthy is currently an accounting professor at Kennesaw State University, where I know he and his colleagues will soon miss him because he is off to the University of Dayton, where he'll be teaching this fall. Dr. Ramamurthy has a refreshing blend of being both a practitioner and an academic. He was a principal at Arthur Andersen. He was the National Sarbanes-Oxley advisor at EY. He was a corporate governance partner at Grant Thornton. He is a highly accomplished writer and speaker, having written over 40 papers, 50 books and monographs, and spoken in 15 countries. But what really distinguishes this CPA, practitioner, and academic is that his PhD is in quantitative psychology, and accordingly, this makes Dr. Ramamurthy our shrink on this panel. Dr. Ramamurthy is a thought leader in the area of behavioral forensics. He is also the lead author of a book The ABCs of Behavioral Forensics, a pioneering book in this field. Please help me welcome Mr. Dr. Lambert Martin. Rounding out this panel is our whistleblower, Mr. Tony Menendez. Mr. Menendez is widely recognized in his decades-long battle with Halliburton as a corporate whistleblower under Sarbanes-Oxley. Despite having no formal legal training, he represented himself during the appeals process and ultimately prevailed in the Fifth Circuit, resulting in significantly increased protections for corporate whistleblowers. Mr. Menendez was honored in recognition for ethical leadership, integrity, and distinguished service and the public interest in both the ACFE's Sentinel Award and the Accounting in the Public Interest Award from Loyola Marymount University's Center for Accounting, Ethics, Governance, and the Public Interest. For more than 2 decades, he has been identifying, researching complex accounting and business transactions. He is a former top controller at General Motors and oversaw the accounting and reporting for more than $100 billion in annual revenues. He is also a former audit executive with EY, where he focused on entrepreneurial and emerging growth companies. Today, he provides forensic accounting and litigation consulting services to attorneys representing shareholders and individuals in complex nationally litigated cases involving allegations of improper financial reporting and auditing. Please help me welcome Mr. Tony Menendez. At this point, if you haven't figured out, I'm the gumshoe on the panel. And so what I hope to accomplish, the 3 of us, we're going to answer the what, whys, and the hows of fraud. So the what is, what frauds will individuals commit? That's the fraud threat picture. And then the why. So our shrink on the group's going to answer the why people do what they do. And then the how is, how can we detect these types of frauds? So what I'm going to do, just briefly before I turn it over to our panel, is kind of introduce what I view as the fraud threat picture here in the U.S. and across the country. I'll try stepping off this podium. Is my mic working? Can you guys hear me? All right. So this is and this will enable me to see the slides as well. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, which is a group of 80,000 professionals, 80,000 members worldwide. They do a biannual report to the nation. They're one of the thought leaders on fraud for occupational frauds. So occupational frauds are those frauds which happen inside of an organization. And they've developed this fraud threat picture. So it's known as the classification system it's the occupational fraud and abuse classification system, affectionately known as the fraud tree. And I know you can't see all the different boxes, but it's just to show you that there's lots of frauds that can happen in organizations. So there's 3 branches. There's corruption, misappropriation of assets, and financial statement fraud. There's good news and bad news about these types of branches. One is misappropriation of assets. So the bad news is the most common types of frauds that occur in an organization. And these would be abuse of credit cards and P cards, travel voucher frauds, investment schemes, skimming at point of sales. These are well understood frauds, and so currently internal auditors can develop internal controls around these. And the good news is, although they occur with great frequency, the dollar loss is relatively low. Then we have the corruption on the left side. There's least known about the corruption branch of the fraud tree. It happens with an intermediate frequency in terms of, it happens less frequency than misappropriation of assets, but more frequency than financial statement fraud. And corruption and conflicts of interest is things like having a relationship inside the company and not disclosing that outside the company. You may have improper relationships with vendors and with customers, and you're not disclosing that, so there's a way to take advantage of that. And that's in the private sector. You can also think about governmental organizations where elected officials or regulators are taking bribes from corporate entities. And so that's that type of corruption. And then you have a collusion between corporations and government officials where they're accepting bribes. These are very hard to understand and investigate because there's internal controls are not able to get at them. Bribes paid in cash are very difficult to detect. And so we at least understand and able to prevent corruption. The third branch in the fraud tree is financial statement fraud. The good news and bad news there is the good news, it happens with the least degree of occurrence. So that's the good news. The bad news is when it does occur, it can result in a demise of the organization, like Enron and WorldCom, the wave of corporate failures right at the turn of the century. So this, for occupational frauds, those frauds happening inside of an organization, this is well known and well understood, and because we know these, with the possible exception of corruption where we know less, but we can develop internal controls and better understand these and prevent them. Now, to complete the fraud threat picture, I'm going to kind of expand it. The first three here is the fraud tree, so financial statement fraud, corruption, and asset misappropriation. Then there's other categories. Now, these aren't occupational frauds. These are frauds that happen to, like cyber crimes. Almost every crime actually in the U.S. usually has some cyber component, has some computer involved, whether it's terrorism or child pornography. There's usually some cyber component to it. But in the fraud realm, the computer is really being used to manipulate and commit frauds. And there's two major frauds that are occurring right now. One is the business email compromise. Anybody heard of this fraud? Significant fraud happening all across the country. Right now it's estimated by the FBI to be about a $3.1 billion fraud. And what this is in a nutshell is somehow through social engineering, making a bad click or a keystroke, or through some aggressive tax, malware is getting introduced into a computer system, and now somebody owns the system. And now they can start looking at emails. And what they're trying to do is change a routing number. So they might get in there and send an email to all your customers and say, we've changed banks, please send the payments to a new account. These are very hard to protect against. There's different ways of doing it, which I won't go into the details. $3.1 billion fraud and increasing, and it's the #1 fraud that's hitting corporate America right now. One of the best remedies for this is social engineering awareness, and anytime you change a routing number inside of a company to have a lot of processes around that, like two people looking at that. Another type of cyber fraud that's really hitting the U.S. right now is ransomware. Anybody hear of ransomware? It's occurring all across the U.S. In the fourth quarter of 2015, the number of ransomware payments that were reported to the FBI. So I know there's lots of payments that are not reported, but there was 41 million in ransomware payments in the fourth quarter of 15. First quarter of 16, which is the last number we have, it like quadrupled up to like $260 million in actual ransom payments that were reported to the FBI. So it's a bad day when you turn on your computer and it says, there's a banner that says your data has been encrypted, and the only way you can get it back is by paying a ransom. Usually this is done through social engineering, and then the major takeaway on how you prevent it, back up your data so that you can reinstall your data. But this is particularly problematic in the healthcare field when you have quality of care for your patients because patients' data has been compromised. Investment frauds, this happens to corporations and individuals. Think Ponzi schemes, penny stock frauds. So that's another category of fraud. Insurance frauds, two types of frauds here. One are predatory companies where you think they're legitimate insurance companies, but they're really just taking your premiums and they never have any intent of paying back the claims when you make them. And then the last category, government fraud, which is probably by category the largest fraud that's in the U.S. Now, government fraud could be Department of Defense fraud, Department of Agriculture, Department of Education. But in our government programs, what is the #1 government program we have in the U.S.? Medicare and Medicaid. So let me run some numbers for you. Our economy is about $18 trillion. And 17% of that is healthcare services and products. So that equates to about $3 trillion. And it's estimated that of that $3 trillion, 5% of it is fraud and abuse. So that equates to about $150 billion in fraud, and about $300 billion was fraud and abuse. So it's the single greatest category of fraud that's facing the U.S. We all get victimized by it because we're all taxpayers. So that kind of rounds out the fraud picture from a very high level, a 30,000-foot view. Let's dig into some of the priorities that the FBI is looking at. The FBI looks at any federal crime, but these are in the fraud and corruption area. These are some of the priorities. Public corruption. And the reason being is, A, these are hard cases to make, so other law enforcement agencies don't do well at investigating public corruption. But if we don't have confidence in our federal level judiciary branch, executive branch, and congressional branch, and at the state and local levels, if we don't have confidence in our public officials, it really could result in the demise of us as a democracy. And while we think internally we have corruption in the U.S., we actually fare pretty well when you look at other countries around the world. So it's the FBI's #1 priority to try to investigate, understand those corruption activities, and then aggressively prosecute all those involved. Healthcare, for the very reason I mentioned, it's about $150 to $350 billion problem, so that's where the money is, and that's a big reason why the FBI is investigating it. Financial institution fraud. All banks are federally insured. So whether you're passing a bad check, obtaining a bad mortgage, paying a bribery to a bank official, all those events would be federal crimes, and they're also investigated and vigorously prosecuted. Corporate fraud, this was the #1 priority just back about 10 plus years ago. So at the turn of the century, when we had the Enrons and the WorldComs and Tycos and Health South and the Adelphias, it just was one after the next. There were like 40 major failures where the integrity of our capitalist society was at question. Could you believe the financial statements that Wall Street's putting out? So George Bush formed the Corporate Fraud Task Force, and it became the FBI's #1 priority in going through and prosecuting aggressively all these major cases. I'll give you a current example of a corporate fraud, one that I'm familiar with because it's happening in Atlanta, Georgia. It's Carter's, which is a publicly traded company, about $800 million in sales, and they sell wholesale clothes to a retailer like Kohl's. So the indictment alleges, and these defendants have been tried, but it's still not fully adjudicated. But the scheme went like this. It was a margin support rebate scheme. Nothing technically illegal about that, and let me explain what it is. So Carter's would sell, for an example, say $100 million in clothing to Kohl's to sell at retails. What Carter's did to incentivize them making these big sales, they would give them a margin support rebate of 35%. That says, we guarantee you'll make a profit of 35%. So this is kind of a win-win. The VP of sales, he gets his bonuses because he made the sale. Carter's, for that quarter anyways, is looking very profitable. And Kohl's like it because they're guaranteed a 35% rate of return. The problem is here, and it's an accounting concept, that if you don't make the margin support, then Carter's is going to write them a check to make it whole. So that difference would be paid in a subsequent period. The accounting principle is a matching concept. Revenues and expenses need to match each other in the same quarter. There was a side agreement and a hidden agreement that the Carter's accounting department didn't know about it, but the margin support rebates would be paid in a subsequent quarter. So it was almost like an accounts receivable lapping scheme where the expenses to pay the margin support happened in further and further quarters. So the stock of everything was a win-win-win in terms of the Carter stocks going up, and everything's looking well until the CFO got wind of this and he started investigating. He then went to the CEO and said, do you know anything about this margin support rebate where the expense is paid in a subsequent period and in a further and further subsequent period? And then this is where the CEO got caught in a problem, in a dilemma that he didn't resolve favorably. He didn't know about the fraud at first, but his friend was the head of VP of sales. So then he covered for him, wrote a memo to the CFO, says, I'm all aware of this, there's nothing inappropriate, and the revenues and expenses are in fact matching each other, which was a false statement. So this caused the Carter's to then perpetuate their false numbers. Ultimately, the FBI, working with the SEC, started investigating this case. And so now the originator of the fraud in the sales department, he's charged. And now the CEO, he's also charged for collaborating and conspiring and covering up the fraud. This fraud is also a little unique and different because in financial statement frauds, we generally think of it happening from the top, the CEO or the CFO originating the scheme and then being perpetrated downward. This was the bottom-up fraud, so it originated at a lower level, and then when the C-suite, the executive management, learned of it, then they become a co-conspirator. But that's a typical case that you might see the FBI investigating, often in conjunction with the SEC. In cyber crimes, just for obvious reasons, and it continues to be our higher and higher priority because the use of a computer is almost an element in every federal offense. Let me kind of round out the fraud threat picture with SEC priorities. So the financial reporting group, or the financial reporting and audit group, they call themselves the audit or the fraud group. They're putting more and more resources into this fraud group. As we get away from the prosecutions of the issues related to the Great Recession of 2008, which consumed a lot of the SEC's resources, they're now dedicating these sources into the fraud group. So they're back to looking at financial statement frauds. They always have, but they're putting more emphasis on it. And now the SEC is getting more and more sophisticated with big data. When when corporations have to report their 10Ks and 10Qs, which is this public information that gets reported to the public, they do it with something known as extensible business reporting language, which makes all the data very readable and usable. And now the SEC and others can take this data and do data analytics with it. You can look at inventory and sales and receivables and net profits. You can take a company's data and look at them over a period of quarters and a period of years and look for outliers. You can use the same data and compare it to your peer groups and see what it looks like, and use the same data for all these SEC registrants at large. So that type of analytical tool is helping them prosecute and look for certain types of financial statement frauds. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, under the Obama administration, this has been aggressively enforced. This law makes it illegal for a U.S. citizen or corporation to pay an improper incentive like a bribe to a foreign official to obtain or retain business. So it's illegal to bribe foreign officials. This is a challenge for many companies to do business overseas. They feel compelled to pay the bribe, but yet if they do it, it's both criminal and civil violations. There was 28 enforcement actions last year. We have a new incoming member to the commission. Jay Clayton has not been approved yet, but he probably will. And so we'll see what his priorities are under the new administration. Insider trading, it's getting harder and harder to effectively conduct insider trading. Again, using analytics, the SEC, FINRA, and the FBI are working in tandem to look at when mergers occur, look at who owned the stock before and after and who's doing large volumes of trading. So it's easier to make those prosecutions. Whistleblower, we have a panel on our table that's going to further flesh out that, but the Dodd-Frank Act made a whistleblower program very much available. Now it incentivizes people who know of corporate wrongdoing, corporate fraud. They can go to the SEC and now they get a bounty, they get a reward. So in the past, it may have been a disincentive to raise your hand and say you're a whistleblower. Now the Dodd-Franks are actually paying people for this information if it results in a tip in excess of $1 million. Another priority is what they call the gatekeepers. So these are the CPAs, these are the accountants, these are those individuals licensed before the commission that they're supposed to shepherd their clients through the process and not be involved in the fraud themselves. CPA firms need to make their hard call when they're looking at financial statements. Are they putting qualified statements, which is the good housekeeping seal of approval, or they're like saying, no, we're going to mark this as problematic. So they're trying to hold the CPA firms, the law firms, and other gatekeepers accountable. And lastly, cybercrime. They're increasingly holding SEC registrants responsible for having best practices and not letting cybercrime happen to corporate institutions. And now these corporations kind of get hit with a double whammy. First, they get a computer intrusion and causes great harm, and now the SEC is going to invite them or investigate them and possibly extract other fines. Recent major case, which is very intriguing, there's a newswire service. So this newswire service, they take information from companies before it's become publicly available and publicly known. In a short window of time, they take it, they compile it, and then they release it. Well, some Russian hackers got in and hacked the newswire service in short windows of time. Sometimes they'd only have a few hours. They could then get in, take this insider information, and trade worldwide, and accumulated more than $100 million in profits. Just fascinating cases the SEC and the FBI is working in the cybercrime area. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our shrink in the panel and hear from Dr. Sri Ramamurthy. Thank you. there's a fascinating book that Dr. Sri Ramamurthy is the lead author on that I alluded to. And the criteria is the best questions that are asked. And we have a very astute group of, it looks like 200 people from here. I don't know, a large group. So I know we're going to have a lot of good questions. But we have accounting firms up here that can audit the quality of these questions. And those 3 students that ask the best questions get to take this awesome book home that you won't want to put it down until you finish reading. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ramamurthy.
Thank you, Vic. Can you all hear me? Yeah. I want to, first of all, thank Dr. Joan Lee, Dean Gibson, and the firm of PwC for making this evening's program possible. I'm delighted to be in front of all of you, talking about a topic that I really enjoy, talking about the psychology of fraud, if I could call it generally that. Ever since I got my PhD in psychology, one of the things that it did for me is it opened my eyes that being the chartered accountant that I was from India and the CPA that I was in the United States, from Ohio, was just not doing it. In the sense, I realized so much of auditing is about human behavior. And if we don't understand the central fact that it's not, a set of books that wake up one morning and commit fraud. It's not a set of computers that decide to commit fraud. Behind every fraud is the central fact that it's one or more people. So how can it be that we don't focus on the people aspect? It's as simple as that, okay? So that's what got me thinking. And so while I got my PhD in psychology more by accident, because I really came to the United States to get my PhD in accounting, and I'm actually, ABD, which is all but dissertation in accounting. Of course, as students, we used to call that all but dead, because like almost there, but not quite. But I can tell you that today, it's become my life's mission to educate accountants about psychology and asking them to learn about psychology by design, not by accident, because it's that important to your careers to learn about human behavior. So let me start with a quick joke. I sincerely hope not too many of you have heard of this joke. It's a Sherlock Holmes joke, and I know my colleague here, Vic Hartman, loves Sherlock Holmes. So here's how it goes. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson wanted to take some time off of their busy investigations at 221B Baker Street, London, England. So they did some hiking in the morning, and as the afternoon wore on, they did some angling, which, as you know, is the British term for fishing. And as the afternoon became evening, they set up a campfire and had a wonderful conversation. And before long, they had floated off to sleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, Dr. Watson was roughly awakened by Sherlock Holmes, asking him with what he heard as a rather ominous question. He said, "Watson, what do you see up there?" Now, Dr. Watson was always intimidated by Sherlock Holmes's cranial capacity and candle power. This was the middle of the night. He didn't want to blurt out something silly, so he took his time. He looked straight up for a while, assembled his thoughts together, and came out with what he thought was a brilliant response. He said, "Astronomically, I see millions of stars and thousands of galaxies beyond. Astrologically, I see Saturn is in Leo. Horologically, I look at my wristwatch and I find it's 2 a.m. in the morning. And theologically, all this should remind us of our Lord God Almighty, in front of whom we are but puny human beings." Sherlock Holmes looked at him, perplexed, and said, "Watson, you idiot, it means somebody's stolen our tent." So I call this my missing the point joke. And so I do hope at the end of my presentation today, I won't have missed the point of this human behavior aspect. All right, So the title of my talk is Bringing Freud to Fraud. So that's part of the book that I've written. Actually, there's a subsection of the book which is literally with that title, Bringing Freud to Fraud. Behavioral forensics and the dark triad. And I will try to be more expansive as I talk about this, because the dark triad, as I'll go on to explain to you, it's only about 1 to 2% of males, and I mean males. So, I think most of the women in the audience, you guys are kind of scot-free. I'm serious, because it's about men, okay? I will talk about that, and Vic, of course, will have the opportunity to ask me further questions for clarification. All right, so moving on. I got to use this, right? Yeah. Okay, good. So in terms of an ethical foundation, William Letwin, in The Origins of Scientific Economics, a book written in 1964, made the following observation. Every economic act, being the action of a human being, is necessarily also a moral act. Doesn't that make you think? The other thing I want all of you studying economics to know is that I'm a little disappointed that economists seem to have forgotten that their founder, Adam Smith, was actually a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And well before he wrote his monumental The Wealth of Nations in 1776, Adam Smith in 1759 had written the book, A Theory of Moral Sentiments. So he was deep into ethics and morality. But lately, with economics growing much more mathematical, they have pretty much given up on the whole area of equity and justice. They don't talk about it anymore. They talk about slicing and dicing, things that can be done in a mathematically tractable fashion. You see, the problem is ethics doesn't lend itself to mathematical analysis very well. That's the problem. So what do? You don't go there. Just don't go there. And that has proven to be a huge problem for the field. And the good news, though, is that increasingly we are finding the resurgence of behavioral economics, a term that many of you may have heard, and also behavioral finance, okay? So maybe today what I'm really talking to you about is behavioral accounting and auditing, okay? If you want, you can assume that. All right. I'm going to be starting to zip through, okay? Because I do have a lot of slides, and I know he's going to give me the hook before too long. So, the theory, a culture of cleverness. So this is from James March of Stanford University. Because income statements matter, many clever people try to make the statements say what they would like for them to say. Clever managers try to outwit clever accountants and clever analysts who are at the same time trying to outwit them. Clever investors and clever public officials try to interpret the information provided through the culture of cleverness. And clever economists try to develop theories of specifying the equilibria of clever processes, that is, processes involving multiple interacting clever people and the pervasive cleverness of calculation. Pretty clever structure, right, of the whole sentence. Well, that's James March for you, one of the most brilliant, organizational theorists. He used to be at Carnegie Mellon, and then he was at Stanford. All right, so that's the theory part, right, because it's coming from a professor. Now the practice part. This is Arthur Levitt. In his speech called The Numbers Game that was delivered in 1998, I fear that we are witnessing an erosion in the quality of earnings and therefore the quality of financial reporting. Too many corporate managers, auditors, and analysts are participating in a game of nods and winks, which is what he called the numbers game. Managing may be giving way to manipulation. Integrity may be losing out to illusion. Now, I wrote a paper last November, I think this was, in the CPA Journal with Dr. Barry Epstein, and we made the comment in there that principles-based accounting standards don't work very well with unscrupulous, unprincipled parties. You do assume that people will follow the rules of the game. It's very difficult to play with somebody who's made it their life's work not to follow the rules of the game. How do you play with such people? It's difficult, right? Now, how many of you have heard of Gresham's law? Anyone? So it's a very famous law in economics by Sir Thomas Gresham, who used to be the Exchequer of England, and he wrote to the Queen of England in those days. And the law is known as bad money drives good money out of circulation. That's Gresham's law, okay? I'm using the same kind of thing to talk about now Besham's law, and Brian Besham is a famous reporter from the UK, and he'll come back in my presentation. He says, in an unregulated world, the least principled people rise to the top. This is one of the reasons why we perhaps need regulations. You can't just have an unregulated market and assuming that everybody will be, behaving wonderfully with each other and, have the kind of the Pollyanna attitude that we are living in the perfect world and only nice people get together and great things happen. That's a pipe dream. So we do need regulation. We do need some accountability. All right, so here is an overview of what I'm going to tell you folks about. So understanding the mind of the fraudster, and I really mean high-level, C-suite, sort of fraudster, going beyond the fraud triangle, and why this notion of the dark triad, perpetrator personality, matters, and why auditors should learn more about this. The apple bushel crop, which is the ABC taxonomy, which is what is discussed in the book, by the way. The book is called ABCs of Behavioral Forensics, and that's really a pun, because the ABCs there stands for bad apple, bad bushel, bad crop. Okay, that's the ABCs. And finally, well, to the best of my knowledge, I think I am the only certified psychological accountant, CPA, in the United States. Now, as long as you folks promise not to call me certifiable, I'm happy to go along with that, okay? So I'll give you some of my opinions and my views. Okay, this picture is actually done by one of my former students. It's from something called Rough Zen or something. All right, so it's a Japanese thing, okay? The hands manipulate the sword, the mind manipulates the hands. Cultivate the mind and do not be deceived by tricks, feints, and schemes. They are the properties of a magician, not of the samurai. And this is by Saito Yakuro. He's a Japanese sword master. So what's really telling about this saying is that, the mind is behind everything. And so if you understand the mind, if you understand the why, you'll make much more progress than just looking at the how. And I can't say it better than Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous American philosopher, the sage of Concord, as he was called. That's kind of near here, I'm presuming. He said, the man who knows how to do something will always have a job. The man who knows why that job is done will always be his boss. Because the why question is more important than the how question. All right, bringing Freud to fraud, how to think like a crook to catch a crook. That's really what it is about. So going from how to why, from looking at the instruments of fraud, which could be sets of accounting ledgers, which could be computers, all that, those are all instruments, to understanding the human motivations behind fraud. So my colleagues and I have set up an organization called the Behavioral Forensics Group just last fall. Vic is one of my partners in that group. I also have another FBI agent, another 25-year FBI agent. These guys are unbelievable. And our website is called www.bringingfreudtofraud.com, and we have a lot of interesting blog entries for those of you who might want to take a look. All right, bringing Freud to fraud. So fraud is all about human behavior. It is not about the controls. It's not about the accounting. It's not about the technology. It is fundamentally about people and trust. So whenever you have a violation of trust, you have fraud in the broadest sense, okay? So think of two cavemen engaging in a barter exchange, okay? So one caveman has a club that he wants to exchange for some berries from the other caveman. And interestingly, the caveman with the club has a gleam in his eye because he knows there is a crack in the club. But interestingly, the caveman with the berries has an equivalent gleam in his eye because he knows he picked those berries a couple of days ago, they're about to spoil. That seems like a fair exchange, what do you think? But that's fraud. Are you all with me? That's fraud. And that's even unspoken. It's just, two cavemen, can't even talk. But that's fraud. Because each party is trusting the other to do the right thing. And these guys, no, they're not doing the right thing. They're trying to, basically sell or receive damaged goods here, right? So either you do full disclosure or it's not kosher. All right. So forensic accounting, which I believe Mr. Hartman is teaching you folks, has been defined as the art and science of investigating people, money, and associated patterns, because these are the key things behind forensic accounting. But what's interesting in that definition given by Mr. Daryl Durrell is that people comes first. And why is that? Money is actually easier to investigate. It's the people aspect that's tough. And why is that tough? Think of Murray Gell-Mann's saying. Murray Gell-Mann is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at Caltech, and he says, imagine how hard physics would be if particles could think. Thank goodness particles don't think. If they could react to what the physicist is doing, it's impossible to do particle physics, right? So that's the same kind of idea here, that we are dealing with people, and people are, by definition, very complex. Behaviors are very difficult to interpret and understand. So internal controls are process-oriented, but people-neutral right now, as the profession has conceived of it. So we need a repurposing of the entire internal control integrated framework to take into account behavioral integrity risks throughout. We cannot any longer be talking about processes in a kind of an inanimate way. No. Every process is going to have implications for behavior. And we've said that behavior is a moral act. And if it's a moral act, every process has moral implications. There's an ethics element, and we need to somehow get that reflected. And accountants and auditors need to be infused with this kind of understanding. Otherwise, it's a failing game. We're going to lose, okay? The other thing is fraud is frequently a team sport. Down in the South, as you know, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, I came across this phrase, which I had not heard before, that the turtle on the tent post didn't get there all by himself. So the point is, it's a team sport, right? It's a group of people committing fraud. It's not always just an individual. And that makes it harder because they're there colluding and collaborating and hiding the audit trail. So we have evidence of that. The COSO fraud studies in 1998 and 2010 indicated that in almost 89% of the cases studied, the CEO and the CFO colluded. To some extent, the comment goes, the CFO is not the chief financial officer, it's the chief fraud officer. So that's a problem, right? That means we really have to worry about this. CEOs have been known to pressure CFOs to cook the books, and that's a study by the conference board. Toxic, insidious subcultures exist. William Dudley talked about it, about Wall Street culture, in 2014 in October. It's a long speech. I think he mentions the word culture like 44 times. And so if you do a content analysis and somebody gives a speech and they mention the same word 44 times, I think they're real serious about that word. So there you go. It's all culture, right? So how can we afford to ignore psychology? That's the bottom line. I don't need to say more, okay? So I'm going to just move on. So in terms of behavioral forensics, think of this. Look at that comment in the middle, which I can't believe I wrote, but I did. Okay. Perpetration of fraud is a very human endeavor involving deception, purposeful intent, intensity of desire, risk of apprehension, violation of trust, rationalization, etc. And after having written it, I looked at it and said, I really didn't find any accounting words in there at all. They're all psychology. And I said, wow, I must have forgotten my accounting. I guess I've just become too much of a psychologist, maybe. But then I also thought to myself, maybe this is what accountants need to understand, that there is so much psychology when you talk about fraud, that accounting is actually the tail, sort of, and we can't be missing out on the dog. All of it is psychology, really. Fraud is more about psychology than about accounting. And then when it comes to emotions, recent neuroscience findings are proving that we are not thinking beings that feel, we are feeling beings that think. In other words, we are more akin to an emotional dog with a rational tail. And yet, here we are, all of the 20th century. Economics is talking about the rational economic man. So you know what they were doing? They were focusing on the tail part. The whole body, which is the emotions, ignored. Nobody was paying any attention. So that's all going to change in the 21st century. And that's what behavioral economics is starting to do. All right, beyond the fraud triangle. So the ABC taxonomy, as I said, is about the bad apple, the bad bushel, the bad crop. And, this is the book, okay? It's also based on an IFP white paper. IFP is the Institute for Fraud Prevention. So if you just do a Google search on Institute for Fraud Prevention, IFP, and, my name or any of my co-authors' names, you'll get that paper. Okay, so the dark triad, how am I doing on time, Vic? 10 minutes. Okay, all right. So the dark triad is a relatively recent area of research, about 15 years old at this point, okay? It's mostly coming out of the University of British Columbia, where we have Robert Hare, one of the foremost authorities on psychopathy. He's been studying psychopaths for over 40 years now. And one of his colleagues is studying specifically the dark triad, and that's Delroy Paulhus, and he's come up with this kind of three things, right? The narcissists, the psychopaths, and the Machiavellians, and they're actually thinking of maybe adding sadists and sadism. They're working on this right now, and in which case, it'll soon be renamed the dark tetrad. So the triad will become tetrad, because there'll be like 4 exemplars. So now that has really impressed me, this area of research. And so with, again, Dr. Barry Epstein, I wrote a paper last March in the CPA Journal, which hopefully is really going to make a difference to the literature in this area. And the title is, Today's Fraud Risk Models Lack Personality. Again, I'm back to my punning games here. When I say the fraud models lack personality, I mean both literally and figuratively. Literally in that personality is not part of the fraud triangle. It's not. Okay, that's the literal meaning. And then the figurative meaning, of course, is that, you know what, we can do better. These models ain't that good. Okay, they kind of lack personality. So that's the other meaning, okay? So I'll tell you more about that and how that happens. So what are these dark triad characteristics? Again, I'm not going to bore you. I'll just tell you, big thing about all these 3 characters is little or no empathy, little or no conscience, disagreeable, and that's why all 3 under the APA, which is the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, are under what is called the antisocial personality disorder. These people are not nice. They're not pleasant. It's not fun to be around them, okay? Because all the time they're trying to exploit you. And after a while, I don't know, man, if you've always got to be having a conversation and holding onto your pocketbook, it's not fun. Because all the time they're trying to cheat you, swindle you, and they don't care. They have no shame, looks like, okay? They don't care. They're going to do what they're going to do, because that's them. So those guys, now I should, again, warn you, very small percentage, 1 to 2% of men. Again, as I said, men. Because when you start looking at women, it literally drops to 1/2 of that. So only 1/2% to 1%. of women would have these tendencies. Okay? So, um, so let me tell you a little bit more about what is psychopathy, which is the darkest of the dark triad. It's a personality disorder that can be looked at from a cluster of interpersonal factors, affective factors. Affect, by the way, is a term that's used in biology and psychology to mean emotion. Okay? So it's not the usual English meaning of the word affect. Lifestyle factors and antisocial traits and behaviors. So if you look at these guys, along these dimensions, yeah, they probably score really high. Okay? So, antisocial personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others that begins in childhood or early adolescence and continues into adulthood. Psychopathy, sociopathy, or dissocial personality disorder. So that's how the APA talks about it in its DSM-4 and the more recent DSM-5 that was released in 2013. All right. So there's an important, slide here. So how do we get the fraud triangle down to a singularity? And this is the shocking revelation, right, that Barry Epstein and I wrote about. So how many of you are aware of this fraud triangle thing? Just raise your hands. A few of you at least? Well, many of you. That's great. So as you know, there is the opportunity vertex of the fraud triangle. There is the pressure or incentive vertex of the fraud triangle. And then there is the rationalization vertex, right? So let's for a minute take a psychopath. Since I've already mentioned to you, a psychopath has little or no conscience, I think it is totally useless for us to be talking about rationalization. There is nothing to rationalize. They have no conscience. They have no idea what you're talking about. Rationalization, you said, is that what good people do? I had no idea. That's what they're going to say. Because they don't understand this. They don't understand this rationalization business. They've never had a conscience. They don't know. Okay. Pressure, incentive. Well, they do enjoy risk-taking. They do enjoy thrill-seeking. So they are attracted to money. And it's all internal. So they're going to go for it anyway. Okay? Any opportunity they're going to get, they are going to take advantage of it. So then, what is between the commission of fraud and a psychopath? Let me tell you what. Lack of opportunity. Which means, if the opportunity exists, he will do it. You can't stop him. He'll do it. So the only thing you can do is to not allow opportunities to be available. Because if the opportunity is available, he's going to do it. Okay? All right. So that's how, from these three vertices, we come to just a singularity, one point. And what is that? Which is the availability of opportunity. And I've got a note here saying no conscience, they are parasitic, acquisitive in terms of their tendencies, and so the fraud triangle collapses to a singularity. All right, Robert Hare, this famous psychologist I told you at UBC, he says, by the way, he's the guy who also wrote this wonderful book with a co-author called Snakes in Suits. When psychopaths go to work, he calls them snakes in suits, okay? He says, I should have spent some time inside the stock exchange as well. Serial killer psychopaths, these are the people he studied most of his life. Serial killer psychopaths ruin families. Corporate and political and religious psychopaths ruin economies. They ruin societies. This is coming from a guy who studied psychopaths for over 40 years, okay? Clive Boddy, with whom I'm actually working right now, in a Journal of Business Ethics article, has contended that corporate psychopaths were primarily responsible for the global financial crisis. And you know why? They don't care. It's the thing you may remember from the Batman movie, where Alfred the butler once says, sometimes you come across these people who just want to see the world burn. No conscience, don't care, okay? So very dangerous. Now here's the other research that has actually just come out, 2017 UK study. High-ranking corporate psychopaths, the snakes in suits I mentioned, could trigger lower-ranked staff to become workplace bullies as a manifestation of counterproductive work behavior, which means they can really destroy the culture of an organization through their behavior. And since they are in a leadership position, they are able to command, a lot of power, and they're able to, use that power. All right. Here is the most astonishing revelation. Look at this. At one major investment bank for which I worked, we used psychometric testing to recruit social psychopaths because their characteristics exactly suited them to senior corporate finance roles. What do you think of that now, huh? Isn't that something? This is what really opened my eyes. I said, wait a minute here. 1 to 2%? Who cares? That's like a really small number, like 1 or 2 people out of 100. Not after this. Not after this. Because suddenly, I think Wall Street, it seems it's over 10% because of this behavior. You're hiring these people. And you know how nature and nurture works? Well, they're born this way, okay? Now they're incentivized to take big risks, which they're happy to take because they don't care if the whole thing goes bust. That's fine with them. And you say, don't worry, I'll also reward you. So now you have nurture and nature working together, and I guess there goes the economy. Because they don't care, and if the rest of us don't care, I think the world is not going to end up in a good place. Okay? So because such deviant personalities are able to take reckless risks that normal, prudent professionals simply cannot, when these outsized bets pay off, they are truly incredible. But when they sour, as we saw in the Wall Street financial crisis, everyone loses, and you see this privatizing gains and socializing losses thing. All right, so I'm just going to speed up here. So here is what I want to tell you about what auditors need. I think auditors need a deeper understanding of human behavior and to exercise a higher degree of professional skepticism when we come across these kind of dark personalities, to become sensitive to fraud risk factors arising out of potentially abnormal, deviant personality traits of those in or overseeing the financial reporting supply chain. Okay? We need to be on our guard. Diagnosis can be quite difficult, for the dark triad types can mimic desirable emotions and be very charming, if they want to be. Further, once in the upper echelons of organizations, they are unlikely to subject themselves to testing. Just try subjecting them to a kind of a polygraph test, or like subjecting them to like diagnosis. It's like, what do you mean? Why? So impossible for anyone to stop them once they've reached there. Tone of the organization, the code of ethics versus the culture, and this is something you could ask about, I guess. But it's basically the culture is much more generic, whereas you can just have a code of ethics on paper, but that doesn't mean much. We're talking about enforcement. We're talking about adherence. Economic dependence makes rank and file employees subject to bullying and intimidation, and when you add collusion in here, you have internal controls that become merely symbolic and not really effective. Interestingly, Dr. Ethel Spector Person, a psychiatrist, says, we usually reserve the term psychopath for the unsuccessful psychopath. Some successful entrepreneurs might also be successful psychopaths. We just don't know it. Okay? They're up there doing quite well, thank you very much. But people who are working with them would know, or they would always suspect, why is this guy like this? But that's what might be going on. Finally, ultimate governance problem. I think we're going to have the smartest guys in the room issue. And the question becomes, how do we grant talented and capable managers enormous discretionary power over the conduct of the business while holding them accountable for the use of that power? That becomes a real issue. Because get this, Steve Jobs at Apple was known to be a little Machiavellian in the way he would, deal with people and all that. And when I said this to a friend of mine, he looks at me and says, Sri, I don't like your line of research at all, and give me back my iPhone. Because see, Steve Jobs also gave us the iPhone. These are absolutely brilliant people. Of course we want them in society. We want to harvest their talents. We want them to be innovative. We want the world to be a better place. The problem becomes these guys don't get it when things go wrong. They have no contrition. They don't care how many people get hurt. And that, I think the rest of us can't stomach. That gets hard. So it's kind of a balancing act, okay, at that point. And I'm just going to conclude with this. I have come across, okay, and also I've talked to many senior accounting firm partners who seem to have had suspicions when they came across such disagreeable doctorate characters in the business world. So it's not like I'm the only guy who's seeing this, okay? Just because I'm going to do research. No. I know a lot of people who are highly experienced partners. So what to do? The debate is not about the truth, but in how to handle it. And I welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm taking the time right now to do my best to share my experience, especially at universities and college students, so that you can get some visibility into the real world and hopefully learn from my experiences. Let me just start off with why SOX? Why whistleblower protection? As this chart describes, look at this is the S&P. Look at the major stock price drops across the board. I mean, billions of dollars was lost. Investors, lots of people lost their jobs, their pensions. I mean, this was a crisis that we hadn't seen. And what they realized was because of this, the impact it had, there were 10 congressional investigations and over 45 congressional hearings. And what they learned was there were a lot of people on the inside of these companies that saw the wrongdoing, and they were afraid to come forward. Or when they did come forward, they were squashed. And so they realized, we got to do something about this, because at the time, there was no whistleblower protection for corporate employees. None. Zip. And so as you look at the picture here, I mean, they're all quite happy. This is George Bush signing SOX into law in 2002. And by all accounts, he should be. I mean, it was a radical law that was designed to do a lot of good. It was designed to empower individuals in the companies to come forward and with the goal of avoiding another Enron, another WorldCom, another disaster. And it had some really important provisions within it. One, because again, there's a couple things. People aren't going to come forward. There's two main reasons people don't come forward. One, they're afraid they're going to be retaliated against. Okay, so they set the law and said, we don't want you to be fearful of that, so we're going to make it a criminal act. If someone retaliates against a whistleblower, they could find themselves in jail for up to 10 years and $250,000 in fines. And the other thing is they were worried that people don't come forward because nothing will happen. They're afraid that the company won't investigate. So what they realized was we need to empower employees to have a direct line of communication. So they made it mandatory for every public company to have direct lines of communication to the board of directors. Right, so if you have concerns about questionable accounting or auditing matters, you can go directly to them. And then most importantly, it created a private right of action. So now employees could have their day in court. And so there was a tremendous amount of scholarly praise for the law. It was designed to be the promised land. Employees were supposed to be empowered with all these new rights. It was a freedom of speech like no other in corporate America before. So here, it gives those who reporting misconduct sweeping new legal protection. Whistleblowers are going to find life a lot easier going forward. So here's a contrarian view. SOX is the most ridiculous thing. Okay, this is an important document because when I was preparing for my legal case, I came across this article that was in the Oil and Gas Journal, and it was from a former Halliburton executive. And he was denigrating SOX in front of the very auditors that were supposed to be holding Halliburton accountable. And the thing that caught my attention was this notion that Sarbanes-Oxley is the most ridiculous thing. I really seized on that at the time because it's like, wow, maybe that's kind of this tone at the top. We're always thinking about tone at the top makes a big deal, right? And here he is saying it doesn't really matter. But I want to dig deeper into his comments here, because looking back, I mean, he was absolutely right. And I've learned a lot from this. Because he's saying that we're spending a lot of time and money on things that don't actually improve anything. That's why it's ridiculous. He says the letter signing activity that appears to lower levels of management to be a blame assignment as opposed to any real change in corporate integrity. And he says if shareholders could see how much money we're wasting just so we can sit back and say, hey, you know, I'm honest, they'd be appalled. Because as he says here, I mean, the fact is, you can't just get a box checking exercise. You need to have real ethical, real integrity. And so the most important thing for companies to do is to hire people with integrity. Okay, so March 2005, I was hired as Halliburton's Director of Technical Accounting. And I have the picture here of Smokey the Bear because that's who my boss told me he wanted to hire, but he wasn't available. So he said, basically, I want your job to be to prevent forest fires, right? This is Halliburton. We're always in the news, and we need to be forward-looking. We need to raise the level of technical competence. Of course, you have to put out fires, but I want you really to prevent them. And right next to this is just to give you an idea of the company I was keeping, the Wall Street Journal did this annual public perception survey, so the top 60 companies and the bottom 60 companies. And if you notice, the company I went to work for is number 57. 3 companies below them, Adelphia, WorldCom, Enron. All 3 of those companies were basically defunct and the executives were going to jail. So as Smokey the Bear, I got there. It's like, well, where's the fire? It was right here. It didn't take me long to find this. Okay, I got a bunch of accounting students, so this shouldn't be too difficult. But I want to explain. This is a bill and hold decision tree. So if you're asking, what's a bill and hold? It sounds hard. It sounds complicated. I'm not sure I can get my head around it. Let me explain it. I want to bill the customer, but I want to hold the goods. Okay, let's just establish it. It's no simpler than that. The problem is, from an accounting perspective, you got to actually deliver the product you're selling to the customer in order to recognize revenue. So delivery is one of the most important aspects of recognizing revenue. So what the SEC says is, absent delivery, we're going to make it very, very difficult for you to recognize revenue. These are bill and hold transactions. So if you ever bill your customer, but yet you're holding the product, in order to recognize revenue, you have to meet these 7 very strict criteria. And if you look at this bill and hold decision tree that they were using, you can see there's no mention of the SEC bill and hold criteria. In fact, it just kind of goes straight into, hey, if just title pass, and if title passes, recognize revenue. And then somehow it says if title doesn't pass, you can still recognize revenue somehow if you meet some other criteria. Okay? I'll just give you an idea that one of the 7 bill and hold criteria is that title passes and risk of loss passes. There's still 6 more. So the problem is when I got there, they were using this. But their entire business model is built around bill and hold. Because they're an oilfield service company, what they do is provide services. So they need to perform these oilfield services. And in order to perform those services, they have to manufacture all this equipment and use product. The problem is they don't know when they're going to do the actual work. So they ship everything to their warehouse and then wait till they actually can go out and do the work. Then they assemble everything, go out there and do the service. Now I sat there and when I first heard this, I was like, wow, I can't approve recognizing revenue because this is clearly a violation. I said, all right, let's do our research. Okay, the company policy, bill and hold transactions clearly refer to situations where you've billed the customer, but you're holding the product. All the training materials that my predecessor had given to the organization recognize physical possession. If you're holding something, you have to go through the bill and hold criteria. White papers, you name it. KPMG, Halliburton's auditor, published this document, Bill and Hold Transactions in the Oilfield Service Sector. in great detail about what the proper accounting is. It described explicitly the situations that were going on at Halliburton. Okay? So what happened? This was my boss. He was the chief accounting officer. Said, well, the issue that developed here, I'm just going to lay it out on the table, is now that your memo's out, because I wrote a memo saying these were bill and hold, we can't recognize revenue unless you satisfy the bill and hold criteria. They said, now that your memo's out, quite frankly, it's really good. And me and others had a lot of discussions, and we think conclusion's appropriate. He goes on, and he says, it was a difficult conversation, but at the end, he said, I felt better because he said, we're going to get out there and fix it. We're going to get back within the lines of what's appropriate. We're going to repair whatever damage was done by using that flow chart. But what happened was they went out and realized how big the problem was. This was their whole business. And correcting an error of this magnitude would have been a tremendous restatement. Now, a restatement for revenue recognition, let alone premature revenue recognition, is probably one of the most costly things you can do. Because whenever you restate for revenue recognition, those demand the most significant drop in the stock price, because that's the most important line item on your financial statements. So investors are all of a sudden saying, wow, I'm not sure I can trust this company, so the stock price drops. Once that happens, lawsuits, SEC investigations, and it gets really ugly. So they trashed my memo and wrote a new memo. And they said, we believe delivery occurs when we put it in our warehouse and title passes. Because we believe delivery has occurred, we don't believe these are bill and hold. So all of a sudden, they didn't have bill and hold transactions anymore. That was the fraud. And so when I raised it, essentially, I was told, save it for the subpoena, and that this issue was negotiated away, and that we had done all we can do. But I didn't think that was true. So I blew the whistle. I contacted the SEC, I contacted the PCAOB. They opened up an informal inquiry. Once the SEC contacted the company, I figured, wow, now I need to do my duty and contact the audit committee. So I followed that important law, that section of Sarbanes-Oxley that said you can report your concerns anonymously or confidentially to your board of directors. So I put faith in that policy, not only because it was required by SOX, but it's also what the company's policy and code of business conduct called for. So I did that, but instead of my email communication going to the audit committee, Halliburton Legal intercepted it, and next thing you know, it was sent to the CFO, Investor Relations, the KPMG audit partner, and within a day, I was outed throughout the company as the SEC whistleblower, as now the SEC is investigating because of my complaint. So it got a little uncomfortable, as you can imagine, for a while there. No one wanted to talk to me. No one wanted to work with me. The auditors specifically were forbidden to even talk to me. Mind you, my job required me to work closely with the auditors every day. My job was to solve accounting problems, but I was shut out. The SEC abdicated the responsibility, just basically turned it over to the Halliburton to investigate themselves. So then the SEC decided never to do an investigation. In fact, I put the gold bars above the PCAOB, because when I met with the PCAOB in December of 2005, the enforcement attorney took that KPMG memo, that publication, it was waving it in the air. He said, this is gold. This is a massive audit failure. But nothing came of it. So at that point, I couldn't do anything about that. My rights were violated. I knew that I trusted that law to protect me. And so when I contacted the audit committee, I expected them to protect my communications, which they didn't. And so I wanted to file a Sarbanes-Oxley claim. My attorney at the time didn't want me to. He wanted me to settle. But I didn't want to settle. It wasn't about money. So I got a letter from him, February 2007, basically saying, you know, this is a letter advising you of your case. You don't have one. You have no damages. You don't have any adverse actions. You basically don't have a case. And because you won't settle, I'm dropping you as a client. Now, that's a harsh reality, but how wrong was he? Look at these stats. For almost the first 10 years of Sarbanes-Oxley, employees, through the end of December 2011, employees won a total of 23 cases. Lost almost 1,300. In fact, for 3 straight fiscal years, 2006, 7, and 8, there wasn't one finding for an employee. That's 488 straight decisions. So no one was winning these cases. But I eventually found a new attorney. He took the case. He was an employment guy, and this was new ground. He believed in my case. We spent a couple years preparing for a case, briefs, depositions. We ended up having a 3-day trial. And after the first day of trial, I get up and I get the Houston Chronicle. Front page of the business section. There's this article right at the top. It says, support for the Lone Ranger. Now, I was like, interesting, because what happened was during opening arguments, Halliburton's attorney was saying, the guy's a Lone Ranger. You know, he's a highly intelligent accountant, but he thought he was always right, and he was somehow the Lone Ranger. So that's how he tried to depict me in opening remarks. But the Houston Chronicle picked up on that. And I want to pull a quote, because this is incredibly important, not just for me, but any whistleblowers. Because what he says is, it's beyond right or wrong. It's never easy to put conscience above a livelihood. It's far easier for employees to keep quiet and let someone else worry about the problem. In some ways, what matters in this case is not whether Menendez was right or wrong, but that he had the guts to stand up. That was back in 2007. We had trial. 2008, get a devastating decision from the court. I lost. My attorney at the time said, we fought the good fight, we did our best, but this is too expensive. No one wins these cases. It's impossible. And so I respected his decision, but at that point, I mean, I really had nothing else to lose. And so I took the case myself. So I began representing myself through the appeals process. And so here's my initial complaint, my initial filing. See, it says respectfully submitted by me. Now, the thing is, it's not only that I lost, okay, that's fine. But what happened was the decision from the lower court was so bad that for all my efforts, I stood to make things worse for everybody else behind me. Because in reaching this terrible decision, what he said was, first of all, he said there's no practical consequence for outing you, essentially wiping that aspect of the law from the books. Like, it's not necessary to protect the confidentiality of the whistleblower, which is wrong. But then he said, all those things that happened to you, the isolation, your loss of duties, all that, everything that happened to you wasn't retaliation, but he said it was recognition of your role. You were an agent of the SEC. He said I was an agent of the SEC, so therefore it was okay those things happened to me. Now, you know what's wrong with that? Because I wasn't an agent of the SEC, I was an employee of Halliburton. So essentially what I said in my brief was the extraordinary seriousness of the ALJ's error cannot be underestimated. The ALJ has written a lengthy decision with major implications, If not reversed, companies would be able to treat whistleblowers as government agents and isolate them accordingly without reservation. This would essentially eviscerate SOX in its entirety. So that was, my appeal. So that was 2008. 2011, the ARB came back and found in my favor what's called affirmed, remanded, and reversed, meaning it wasn't a wholesale victory, but it had to go back to the lower court. They said definitely what happened to you was retaliation. And by doing that, they actually lowered the bar for what was a retaliatory action. So early on, my attorney said, hey, you don't have any retaliation actions because those weren't accepted. But now because of this ruling, it actually lowered the bar. And so when they came back and they affirmed it, there's an important quote. They said, the facts of this case exemplify the very reason Congress mandated publicly traded companies to set up confidential avenues of reporting wrongdoing. But they sent it back to the lower court. By this time, he probably didn't like me any more than he did before. He dismissed it again. But at this point, he felt like I just dismissed him, but because you're probably just going to overturn me again, I have an alternative finding. So one in which he was retaliated against. Okay, because he said, hey, we'll just speed up the process because you're going to overturn me, so just, you could pick this if you like. And then he had to find for me damages. And he came back with 2 findings there, too, to give the appeals court something to choose from. And he said $1,000 was damages. Remember my first attorney said you have no damages? He said $1,000. And the judge said, well, that's all he asked for, because that's all I asked for. I didn't ask for any money, because it wasn't about money. But then he came back and said, well, if the law were to interpret that it goes beyond these non-tangible employment actions, then I would give him $30,000. Because prior to that, whistleblowers weren't getting this non-tangible employment action. So pain and suffering, emotional distress, professional, degradation or diminution of authority. So again, the ARB came back and reversed him. So I think I have a win here. But the problem is it's only March 2013. Halliburton appeals to the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals. Now it's November 2014. The 5th Circuit Court of Appeals finds in my favor. Whoops. Not over yet. We go all the way to March 15th, where another ruling comes out from the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals, eventually making my case permanent in terms of the law. Now, this chart troubles me quite a bit, to be honest, because if you look at this is out of the ACFE Report to the Nations. It's identifying who actually identifies and reports corporate fraud. At the very top of this list is by tip, which is whistleblower individuals. So we're at 40%. And you go on down the list, now you see the institutions that are actually charged with fighting the fraud. And the thing that troubles me, so if you look at the external audit, it finds 3%, roughly 3%. According to this chart, the idea that a fraud will be detected by accident is more than twice as likely, at 7%. So what we're seeing here is that as a society, we're depending on the people with the least amount of resources and the most to lose to handle one of our most important functions. And so what I want to see is in a few years, this chart flips. And hopefully when you guys get out in the marketplace and you're working, I'll see that. So this is the end. I leave this last slide up here. I just like it because it says a river cuts through rock, not because of its power, but because of its persistence. So when I set out here 10 plus years ago, I didn't have any power. I didn't have any money. I didn't have any influence, right? But I was never going to give up. So, thank you.
All right. All right, what I want to do is just ask 2 questions of our panelists, but I would encourage you to now think of some questions for the 3 of us. And while you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to have the first one to Dr. Ramamurthy. We'll give a brief overview of my perspective of the corporate failures of Enron and WorldCom, and then have Dr. Ramamurthy kind of react. And what I've set up here is this paradigm of a situational versus a predatory fraudster. So what does that mean? Let me kind of set the stage. WorldCom was a very large company, fast-growing throughout the 1990s, and it was really a tech company. And what they were doing is they were banking on and working with the explosion of technology. There was pagers at the time, which I know this group probably hasn't seen a pager, but there were pagers, faxes, the internet was exploding, cell phones, and there was this great demand for technology. And technology uses phone lines to pass this data along. The primary misstep that WorldCom had is their market forecast was that the demand for the data, for their usage on their phone lines, for their line costs, was going to grow 8-fold a year. So that was an underlying flaw. That was what they believed. That's what their market studies were showing. But in fact, it was something less. But these line costs, they had to incur them, and they were fixed costs, and they were in the billions of dollars. And so they had these fixed costs. And then in the oncoming quarters and months, revenue did not come in like they thought they were going to do. And so then in October of 2000, there was a fork in the road. The executives, the CEO and the CFO, the C-suite individuals had to make this decision. We can't make Wall Street's numbers. Our revenues are not coming in high enough to exceed the cost of our line costs. So what are we going to do? These executives are making this decision, and they make it in the corporate environment. So what's the tone at the top? What's the culture of this organization? This is a very difficult decision for them to make, because if they decide to report the true earnings, it's going to cause the fall of the stock. They're going to lose their compensation packages, and CEO Bernie Ebbers is going to lose a lot of things that he had leverage. So that was one option, to report the good numbers and suffer those consequences. Or we know what they did. They cooked the books. And for our accounting students, it was an easy credit and debit. They credited the income statement account, line expense, and they debited property, plant, and equipment. They then did this for 7 consecutive quarters, and it turned into about a $5 billion fraud just in accounting, and ultimately the fraud was about $11 billion. But this is what I would call a situational fraudster. They didn't buy WorldCom for the purpose of setting out to do this fraud. They didn't have a long track record of doing this fraud. They were in a fork in the road to make a very difficult decision, and obviously in hindsight, we know they made the wrong one. So that was the decision-making process at WorldCom. Let me contrast that with Enron. Enron, too, was a very fast-growing company with there was an expectation to see their expectations. They were the number 7th on the Fortune's 500 in terms of revenues. But they never faced a situation. There was never a fork in the road. There was no specific reason to create special purpose entities. These were legal vehicles to take the debt off the balance sheet and hide them in these special purpose entities. There was no fork in the road, no specific need to do that. There was no specific need to get on the phone call with analysts and lie and exaggerate their particular revenues. There was no specific need to just run up the stock. This was a different culture. Their environment, there wasn't a fork in the road. They were more predatory in nature. It's almost like they were radicalized. So if we think about the fraud triangle, at WorldCom, they had an opportunity, which all these did. If you're in the C-suite, you always have the opportunity to override internal controls. And with WorldCom, they had this pressure to meet the numbers, and then they had lots of rationalizations they could use. But in Enron, I make the argument that it was more like, I think Dr. Ramamurthy's point, these are more like predatories. There's no pressures and rationalizations. They didn't need those. They were just doing it because they had hyper-competitive attitudes. And so I guess my question for you, Dr. Ramamurthy, is if this is the corporate governance, if these are the corporate cultures that when facing these, is there hope for us going forward? What can corporate governance and audit committees and board of directors do, knowing that there's these type of decisions makers in the boardrooms? How can we identify them? How can we prevent them? And what can we do going forward?
Well, that's a pretty difficult question. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. The first thing I should mention is that both Enron and WorldCom were Arthur Andersen clients, and I used to be at the world headquarters of Arthur Andersen at that time. So let me first start by telling all of you I was on neither client. Okay? Very important, right? I was in the professional standards group, and so I used to consult with a lot of clients, but I never had the opportunity to talk to anyone from WorldCom or Enron. But having said that, what Vic is saying is absolutely right. WorldCom looks to me like the conventional fraud triangle type of a fraud, in that they saw the kind of extreme pressure that forced them to come up with some accounting tricks. I don't know whether all of you have heard of this. If you haven't, it's very nice. It's from the late Professor Abraham Brilloff, the difference between GAAP and crap. And crap, according to Professor Brilloff, was cleverly rigged accounting ploys. That's crap. And of course, we all know what generally accepted accounting principles is. So, so I guess when people make entries like, debiting whatever the asset account and then crediting expenses, yeah, you're going to have a bloated, balance sheet, and you're going to nicely have an inflated income statement as well. So when it's like accounting 101 in terms of doing fraud, but okay, it was a clever technique, and I think it is, probably Arthur Andersen's error in not having picked that up, especially when the numbers were probably very material, as Vic said, 5 billion plus. But all that does come under the fraud triangle area. The predatory fraud, which I'm quite convinced now, in retrospect, which was happening at Enron, and really dangerous characters in the boardroom there. For one thing, again, if you look at the history, I don't know how they pulled it off, but Andrew Fastow, the former chief financial officer, was able to get what is called an ethics waiver, not once, twice. First of all, I'd like to know, some of you are taking courses on ethics, right? Can somebody explain to me what an ethics waiver is? Does it mean that go ahead and be unethical and that's okay? Is that what it means? And that is exactly what it meant, by the way, okay? Because on many transactions involving LJM, he was on both sides of the transaction. He was transacting, on behalf of Enron, but he was also the CEO of the LJM entity. And so that's clearly a conflict. I mean, he can't do that. But they gave him an ethics waiver. They said, but that's okay. No problem. And so when this kind of stuff is going on, this clearly suggests a culture that is extremely toxic, and they are willing to go to extreme lengths to cook the books and do whatever it takes. And they also have personalities, because Enron was known to be full of sharks, I guess. And so when a bunch of sharks get together, I think, going back to what Professor Robert Hare was saying, I think we in society ought to be very, very scared, because this is an unstoppable group, and they could cause a lot of damage, okay? So in terms of solutions, since I have been in the corporate governance area too, clearly from a governance level, I think people need to understand behavior at a basic level that I've been talking about today. They need to understand the fraud triangle, not use the term accidental fraudsters, which you'll see in the literature. And I'm so happy that Vic, has now literally graduated to calling it situational fraudsters. And the reason why I'm now totally against accidental fraudsters is because fraud is never an accident. And to the extent you call it an accident, it is not fraud. Are you all with me? Because fraud needs to have scienter. It needs to have intent. And if it was an accident, and by accident you committed fraud, well, probably it was an innocent mistake or something, you can explain it away. Then that's not fraud, okay? So I'm glad he used the word situational. So situational fraud and situational fraudsters, the fraud triangle actually works because most normal people would come under the fraud triangle. It is when we start moving in the dark triad area that things start really getting complicated. Because, as I said, the fraud triangle is incomplete. It doesn't take into account these dark personalities, but it's a very small percentage, except that, let me just make one more statement, which I didn't make, so that all of you understand why I'm worried about this dark triad aspect. Professor Ronald Schouten, who's a psychiatrist at the Harvard Medical School, has written a book, and the title itself is brilliant. It's Almost a Psychopath. So we are not people who should be worried only about psychopaths, but we should be worried about subclinical psychopaths as well. People who are not quite there, but it's like, I guess people who study psychopathy will say, well, give the fellow some time, and you'll get a full-fledged psychopath. It's kind of those kind of things. So does that make them less dangerous? No. They're showing already all the tendencies to be a very, very dangerous, operator. And so you need to be aware of these personalities. So I think going forward, I actually see a day when accounting firms may need to actually have psychologists and psychiatrists on staff as part of the client acceptance and retention procedures and do interviews, things like that, and even demand, evidence from companies about any personality tests that these people may have been given at the point when they were hired. Because clearly, as I told you in my talk, if you go to them when they're CEOs, they are not going to subject themselves to any testing. But, hey, 20 years ago, when they were hired, if there was some information, let me tell you, a leopard doesn't change its spots. It was there, and you can pick it up from there. And of course, at that time, probably those HR questionnaires did say, don't lie on this, otherwise you may be subject to dismissal. So, okay, so they did fill out, and they were young. Probably they didn't pick up that this could be used much later. It's kind of like, tell all of you young people, don't make too many embarrassing disclosures on Facebook, guys. Not a good idea. Same thing, okay? It will come back to haunt you later on because people are looking, and this is all public information, okay? So yeah, I think human behavior in general, understanding models, and realizing that it could be the fraud triangle, it could be the dark triad, and most importantly, it could be not just the individual, it could be collusion, it could be culture. So we do have to look also at this bad apple, bad bushel, bad crop, the levels and the units of analysis. So I'll just leave it there.
All right, perfect, thank you. I'm going to throw one more question over to our whistleblower, Mr. Mendendez, and then we're going to open it up to all you guys. So Congress never passes up on a good opportunity to pass legislation. Whenever any calamity occurs, then Congress has to respond and it's going to fix the problem. And I'm going to briefly characterize 3 pieces of legislation that brings us along the whistleblower route and then kind of have Tony respond to it. Back in 2005, Congress passed the Litigation Reform Act of 1995. It got codified in the SEC regulations under 10A, so it became known as 10A. And what this does is 2 main things. A says auditors, external auditors, have to look for fraud. And then B, if they find this fraud, they got to report up to the board of directors and then out to the SEC. So it's almost like mandatory whistleblowing. There's sanctions. You have to do this. So that was a road mark in 1995. And then Sarbanes-Oxley in 2010, and Tony's kind of already laid some of that out. What that helped for whistleblowers, it just protected them. It didn't incentivize them, but it protected them so there wouldn't be retaliation. And then with the last crisis we had, the Great Recession, the financial debacle of 2008 and the preceding years, Dodd-Frank was then passed, and what it did, it now incentivized whistleblowers. It says if you have a substantial claim, you go to the SEC and you're meritorious, then you can, if the claim's over $1 million, then you might win up to 30% of that, and these claims are now coming to fruition, and whistleblowers are now collecting these bounties. So given this history, Tony, of the whistleblower from not really being protected to now we're going to protect them, now we're actually incentivize them. What's your perspective on going forward? Your whistleblower status started many years ago, and now you've had a lot of time to reflect on this. Do you have any predictions or words of wisdom or thoughts of going forward for the plight of the whistleblower?
Well, yeah, I think, is this working? Hello?
Yeah, I think it is.
I think it's a very good question. So for all that it's worth, I mean, Dodd-Frank, it didn't change a lot of the protections that were already there. So first of all, let me say this. Between 2005 when my case started and 2015 when I won, the law never changed. You know what changed? Was the people. It were the individuals that were investigating and adjudicating these cases. That's what changed. So Bill and Hold has been on the books since 1999. That's fine. That law didn't change. But Sarbanes-Oxley never changed. So what happened was, when the Obama administration came in, we got a new Secretary of Labor, we got new federal judges, they started being more employee-friendly. So now we have Dodd-Frank in response to a new crisis. And there's a couple really important benefits of Dodd-Frank. One, it does away with mandatory arbitration agreements, so you guarantee your day in court. But this big bounty is when it gets most of the attention. I guess I struggle with it a little bit. There's positives and negatives to the bounty. One, let me start off by this. Remember I told you there's 1,300 employees that came forward and lost? There was no bounty. They didn't need a bounty to come forward. I would suggest most whistleblowers are not coming forward because of money. They're coming forward out of principle. They're trying to right a wrong. And so now we have a law that's incentivizing them, and big dollars at that. My concern with that incentivization is it's really just going to be able to allow everybody to paint the whistleblower with this broad stroke. Oh, they're just out for the bounty. That's my real concern with the bounty program. Now, at the same time, one of the major failures of Sarbanes-Oxley was it didn't have a bounty program. All right? So what that was, why I struggled and why I had to represent myself for so long, is I couldn't find an attorney to take my case. There's no money in it. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, the only thing you can do is get your legal fees back. Okay, you only get your legal fees back if you win. So if we're talking about a 2% win rate, what attorney, what reasonable, halfway smart attorney is going to take a whistleblower case? They're not. So I kind of wrestle with those two things. The benefits of the bounty in terms of allowing whistleblowers to get representation that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten versus the broad stroke that people will paint whistleblowers as just out for money.
I'll just, one quick follow on. I'm representing two bounty hunters under Dodd-Frank, and you can also be anonymous. And it's an easy form to complete. You just, if you got to substantiate the fraud, have your client sign an affidavit, you can file it anonymous, and then just wait and see what happens. So it is a streamlined approach. But at this point, let's turn it over to our students. We have a lot of you here, accounting and otherwise, so you don't have to be an accounting student to ask any questions of our distinguished panelists. So I would encourage you, any of you, to just fire away of any question you'd like to ask.
Mr. Menendez, I was wondering if you have ever thought about regretting your decision. If so, why? If not, why not?
Well, it's an excellent question. It's not an easy one to answer because when I set out on this path, I never in a million years thought it was going to be this hard. I never thought it was going to take this long. It was always at the next turn, someone else is going to step up. Okay, whether it was the auditors, my boss, the SEC, PCB, the judge, somebody helped. So I held out hope for the longest period of time. That's what kind of kept me going, was the hope that, this will turn around because it's the right thing. But then when I got my decision in 2008 when I lost, and that was devastating because it really, at that point I was like, wow, I really am going to make things worse. Because with this decision in hand, companies will just be able to, they'll have a playbook for everyone to follow me. And that really troubled me. And so at that point, I had nothing left to lose. And if it's true that the law was not going to protect anybody, I felt like I was going to take it as far as I could so that people can learn from it. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so this can apply to all three. Even with sovereigns, Oxley, whistleblowers, the FBI, sex, psychoanalysis, more unethical laws, miles and triangles, and pressures toward orders, is it inevitable to avoid having psychopaths and subclinical psychopaths enter into the accounting world in the future?
If I could, you can talk about psychopaths.
Tony and I are going to quickly refer to Dr. Ramamurthy on that question.
What I will say, in my experience, from what I've seen in numerous cases, is the accounting fraud. It really gets back to the cover-up is worse than the crime. What I think we have a real problem in the profession for lack of accountability. People are afraid to come forward. So if you make a mistake, most frauds start off small, and then they get big. And I think that's really where it starts. And we get a lot of well-intentioned people that somewhere along the chain, they don't want to come forward that there's been a mistake made. And that's most of the fraud that I see. And I would say that's really what I saw at Halliburton. I mean, the fact that they weren't accounted for bill and hold for so long, that's okay. It was a mistake. Lots of companies make that mistake. But the problem was when they tried to cover it up, that's when it became fraud.
So, no, this is going to be with us as a problem, for the foreseeable future. That's why one of my last slides said that this is very much a societal issue. What are we as a society willing to, I guess, sacrifice, okay, to get highly talented individuals, because many of these folks are brilliant. There's a reason why the Enron folks had the book, The Smartest Guys in the Room. They were the smartest guys in the room. And did you all see why it was not gals, but guys? Yeah, because those are the doctorates too, right? So it's the guys, okay? So the problem is they're very bright, but they have this serious, downside that we ought to be paying attention to. And so it becomes a kind of a balancing act. And that is a kind of conversation that we need to have, not only as an accounting, profession, because we've been charged, with sort of evaluating the propriety, you might say, of, companies that we audit. And so to that extent, yeah, it becomes our problem, and it's very, very unfortunate that whenever there is an audit failure, or rather, there is a business failure, it is equated to an audit failure. Not true. Not true. Somebody else screwed up on the business side. But the blame, is put on the auditor, right? So it's that, I don't know whether you have heard of this phrase from the medical profession. The operation was successful, but the patient died, right? And when we say that, that's kind of where we are left with too, right? In auditing, all I can do is follow the professional standards. I can do everything that my profession asks me to do. What more can I do? And then there are these doctorate characters in the mix. I'm screwed, I guess, at that point. I can't do anything more. That's our profession. So we need to really think hard about this and how to kind of, deal with it, especially at high levels. We need to be very, very careful. So this is a dangerous situation we're in.
This is a question for Mr. Menendez. What other aspects of your life, or I guess, which aspect of your life would you say that blowing the whistle affected the most?
Every aspect. I mean, yeah, it really affected every aspect. I'm not going to kid you, it wasn't easy. It can be a pretty lonely experience, but, for me, it was, who am I as a person, I wanted to, this was a test for me to see who I was. And I couldn't have done it without my wife, because, there was, there's days it's like, wow, is this really worth it? She'd say that, or I'd say it first maybe, and then she would say, oh, it is. You got to do it, We have to do this. Someone's got to. And a few months down the road, we get another setback, and then she's like, are you sure, And then I'm like, no, we got to do this, So at the end of the day, I guess I wanted to find out who I was, and I wanted to set an example for my kids, and I want people to learn from my experience. So I never thought I was going to win, so it's icing on the cake to have won, and to know that that body of law has been improved, and whistleblowers now are finding it a little bit easier to win their cases. And I'm getting an opportunity to share my experience with a lot of students like you. So hopefully in the long run, I'll have an impact there. Like I said, I want to see that chart flip. Counting on y'all.
This question is for Mr. Hartman. In your opinion, why do you think more people didn't go to jail following the 2008 financial crisis?
Well, that's a brilliant question. That must be one of my students. Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and people have a benchmark of, we've seen other calamities and other failures in the last 20 or 30 years, and those individuals went to jail, so why didn't these individuals? I first started as an FBI agent working savings and loan fraud, and in those cases, they were just easier to build because there was a loose grip group of individuals. You could see their criminal intent, you could prove the conspiracy, and you could follow the specific money to these specific individuals, prove those cases under the criminal law, and put them in jail. So those are relatively easy. Then, at the turn of the century, we had 4 or 5 years of one failure after the next, Enron and WorldCom and HealthSouth and Tyco, and it was one after the next. And those two were easier to prove in that you had specific groups of individuals which you could identify by name, understand their specific conduct, trace the money and see how they gained, and show that they met the criminal elements of the statute. So that was kind of the standard by which America had seen these other corporate calamities and systemic failures, and people went to jail. Then in 2008, we had this slow-moving train wreck of the calamity, which was largely brought on by the mortgage failure. And to understand how mortgage works from origination all the way through collateralization, you have paper, which means somebody bought a mortgage on the street. And that's often the easiest case to prove is when that person originated a mortgage and committed fraud on the financial statement. Nobody really wants to prosecute those people because they're individuals just trying to buy a home. But Congress then incentivized these easy loans to get, people lied on them, and then this bad paper, I call it, the mortgage and the promissory note, start going through the system. So it would go from the originator of the purchaser, then it would be resold to another bank. Many of these cases were then backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Theoretically, they weren't going to be bailed up by the government under then existing law, but everybody assumed if everything hit the fan that they would back them out, that the government would bail them out. And then these mortgages, then they made their way through Fannie and Freddie and or through Wall Street, and they got collateral-backed mortgages, and then they got bought throughout the world. So now you have the culpability spread among all these different agencies. And then there were rating agencies who rated the bonds, right? So now in the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office and DOJ spent a lot of time a lot of bad things happen here. Who we're going to put in jail? So of all these different organizations, the originators, the people who resold the mortgages, Freddie and Fannie, Wall Street, who is that individual that you can prove this scienter, this mens rea, this criminal intent? So what federal statute, what people conspired, where did the money go, and who did wrong? So it was very much a challenge then to prove who did that. They all had plausible denial. They took this paper and they just passed it on to the next. It was like musical chairs, and when the music stops, everyone who's caught with the paper is now liable for that paper. Ultimately, the government bailed everybody out. So all the taxpayers on the hook now, and now taxpayers are up in arms as to who to put in jail. So I always ask people when I get that question is, well, who is that banker? And give me his name and tell me the illegal conduct that he did so we can put him in jail. It became very much of a challenge. Now, the SEC and DOJ was able to go after large institutions and go after them civilly, and they did, and they paid fines in the billions of dollars. So there was some retribution in terms of we got some of the money back from the bankers. But having any specific individual go to jail, it's just been very problematic because it was like this loose-knit conspiracy of all these different market players, but they never sat down and conspired. They just all understood how the game was played. And so on the bottom line, now we're left with this crisis with, trillions of dollars that were lost and squandered, and we don't have executives in jail. And it just became a failure of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody had that criminal intent to commit securities fraud, mortgage fraud, wire fraud, or other conspiracies.
Vic, I just want to.
What was that quote you said earlier?
Yeah, I'm going to say. So, this whole area of alibis and plausible deniability is sometimes expressed best in idioms. And so I'm going to tell you guys about this Nigerian proverb, which goes, "When the mouse laughs at the cat, there must be a hole nearby." So that's also part of all this, that you've already figured out how to escape. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you had a quote earlier about, I guess if there's lack of regulation, the worst actors are going to bubble up to the top.
yeah.
something to that effect.
The Basham's law, yeah.
And I think that's really what we saw. I think in 2002, 2003, when we put people in jail, I'm not sure the cases were that much harder to prosecute. I think there became a lack of a will to prosecute. And I think, and this is why I say this, because in 2005, when I was with the SEC, when they were looking the other way on my situation, they were also looking the other way on Bernie Madoff, Alan Sanford, and a whole host of frauds. They just simply didn't have a will to invest, to regulate. And I think that's going to have a lasting impact, and I think that's probably part of the reason we had the 2008 financial crisis.
My question would be, how would the action of whistleblowing or having the title of being a whistleblower affect your opportunity to get employment in your field after that fact?
Yeah, it's very difficult. Certainly, now most people point to me and they say, "Oh, well, you're the exception to the rule. You got this great job at General Motors." I was a controller at General Motors, had this great job, and people say, "Well, how did that work out?" And I said, "Well, it's kind of like a perfect storm, if you will." I think in 2009, when I went to work, when I went to interview there was only one company whose future was less bright than mine. You understand? General Motors just filed for bankruptcy. They were, who knows if they were going to survive the next 3 months. And I kid about that, but at the same time, there's the chief accounting officer at General Motors. His name was Nick Cypress. He really was a unique guy. He was he was, more of a rebel. I mean, and I always say it took someone like him to hire someone like me. Okay, this was actually, like I said, a perfect situation. This was General Motors. He was at the end of his career. He was tasked with cleaning this up and bringing them out. And so he welcomed what I had to offer and really appreciated it. But I just think we need more people like that, more people willing to take a chance on whistleblowers. I use this analogy. My wife gave me this one. So I could get 2 cars driving down the street. Cop car pulls up behind both of them. This guy in the right-hand lane, not speeding, stopped at every stoplight. Perfect driver. Probably never had a ticket in his life. He looks in that rearview mirror and sees that cop. What happens? He tenses up. He'd rather that cop not be there, right? That's what happens. These are good people. They're good drivers, but they just don't, so they don't hire the whistleblower. Yet we need more people like that. Now take the other next lane. This guy's, he's ran every red light, he's speeding, and the cop pulls up behind him. Well, he's not going to hire the whistleblower either, okay? So we need these people in the right lane to take a chance on bringing these people in, because I think we want to have a successful society or business or organization. You have to encourage debate. You got to have thick skin in order to get to the right answers. You got to have diversity of thought and opinion. So,
sorry to disappoint you. Psychopaths will not hire whistleblowers. They don't like them.
So my question is for everyone on the panel. I was wondering if you think that, since you were talking about going into behavioral economics now in the 21st century, moving back towards it, if you think that universities should require a class, for business school specifically, require a class in behavioral economics or classes, psychology classes, instead of just social sciences as a more general requirement.
That's very, very well stated. In fact, the second article that my co-author and I wrote in the CPA Journal, that is one of our recommendations, going forward, that, students should not be allowed to graduate with a major in accounting without at least one course in the psychology of judgment and decision-making, understanding how human behavior plays a role in their lives. Just so all of you know, my PhD dissertation in psychology was written on the topic of judgment and decision-making, and specifically the auditor's planning materiality judgments that they have to make as they go into the audit. And that's a completely psychological thing. If you, no wonder we don't have in the profession any standard. You can't have a standard. There are so many factors that affect that judgment. It's highly complex, and so you need to understand as an auditor how much you're relying on your psychological resources, who you are as a person, your emotions, the way you kind of look at the world. Everything goes into those judgments. And then talk about professional skepticism. I think a lot of your critical thinking abilities are going to drive how professionally skeptical you're going to be. That's again a psychology thing. So there is so much psychology here that it's a shame that students are coming out without realizing how much they're going to be relying on that maybe one course, maybe the two courses that they hopefully would be taught, and suddenly it'll just open their mind. And I know many of you are smart enough that you'll then be doing a lot of reading on your own. And some of you might get even more, because let me tell you one thing. Psychology is a very popular major in college, and for a reason. It's fascinating. It's very, very interesting. So once you have that beginning kind of, course, that's enough for you to learn then by yourself and learn more and, sort of become a student of human behavior, and that's going to serve you very well in your career. So,
Being mindful of time, we're going to allow one last question, and then we're going to wrap it for the night.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. I just thought I'd ask, since we have a variety of perspectives here, what you guys think the reason for many whistleblowers being females. I'm stating that anecdotally, but in your experience as a whistleblower, it seems like you've done a lot of research on other whistleblowers and their cases, and as a psychologist. And then I know Professor Hartman has commented on that in class. So if you guys could just comment on what you think the differences between males and females are and why females are more apt to blow the whistle. Thank you.
Yeah. I did mention this in class today, but for the benefit of the audience, in 2002, Time's Man of the Year was 3 women whistleblowers. And ironically, I personally knew all 3 of them before they made this. One was my counterpart, Miss Riley, out of the Minneapolis office of the FBI, where she was Chief Division Counsel. Then there was a whistleblower from WorldCom, Cynthia Cooper, and then the whistleblower from Enron, Sharon Watkins. And I had met all these 3 ladies because I investigated on Enron and WorldCom and met them and interviewed them. And not just, so that was kind of coincidental. 3 women were whistleblowers of the year, and they made Times Magazine. But I've also seen that in my career with the FBI. When somebody walks in the door, I mean, usually, what does corporate America look like, especially at the higher levels? More male than females, right? And yet I'm seeing more females as being whistleblowers. So this is totally my theory. I mean, I wish somebody would study this because I do find it fascinating. But what I see is the people that they're blowing the whistle against, it's kind of like the boys club, because who's on the board of directors in the C-suite? It's changing for sure, but generally they're male, right? And so my perspective is when you see the middle-level management, that they're close enough to the executive management and they're seeing the wrongdoing, the males who see this wrongdoing, they view themselves as, that's part of the boys club and I'd like to be there too. And so why should I blow the whistle on them? Because I'm inspiring to be there. But the women may have a different view, that they might not see themselves getting there for this perceived glass ceiling or otherwise. And so they're very frustrated that this group that's kind of preventing them from joining the boys club, and they see wrongdoing, and so they have a tendency to blow the whistle. That's completely my theory and what I've seen. And it'd be fascinating if somebody could validate that through some study, but that's been my experiences. I'm curious as to you, Tony, or others.
I've done a lot of studying on whistleblowers, and I'm not aware of any studies. So that was kind of new to me. I'd have to think about it, but I couldn't guess as to why, if that's the case, but...
The only thing I'll say from a sort of social psychology perspective is that, so we have in-groups and out-groups. And as we all have discussed here, most of Wall Street, has been run by men for the longest time. There are very, very few women in there. So women, when they do come in, they are part of an out-group. They are not part of the in-group, okay? The in-group develops its own codes of behavior. And one of the things in clubs, in groups, is that you do not spill the beans. You do not try to put down the group in any way, because, yeah, they will take action. You just have to watch the movie Godfather to know that, right? So, and then there are words like omerta that you may have heard of, the code of silence, among people, engaging in kind of, shifty behavior or whatever. So these women, I think, who are part of the out groups, they literally were appalled at what they saw happening. First of all, they are newcomers to the game. They didn't understand the game. And so that's why I think they're the first ones to complain, because it's not like the guys didn't notice or whatever. They might even understand it more. But the other thing is, to kind of, Tony's point, the statistics does not seem to support the whistleblower. You are going to be, basically having a pretty hard life after that. I mean, and remember, we have phrases, in our culture here. Snitches get stitches, okay? So you know what it means to be a whistleblower. So it's just very interesting to me that the in-group, out-group might potentially solve the problem. I don't know. That's, again, hey, this is what is called a conjecture. It's not even a hypothesis, okay? So.
I want to thank our panel and thank you all for hanging in here. Shri, do you want to tell us who won those 3 books?
The envelope, please.
Yeah, Joe, would you do the honors? I'll tell you. So, again, I just have a, you have it. So, this young woman, the last question that was asked. The last question.
The whistleblower. Woohoo!
Who was next to you over there?
Yeah.
The question came from over
Yeah.
there.
Right.
I don't see her now.
You got to be present to win.
Yeah, you got to be present to win.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh.
All right.
Thank you very much, Joe.